Calvin Reeves was 37 years old when his wife removed his name from the deed to the house he had built with his own hands on a quarter-acre lot in Nashville, Tennessee, and she had done it on a Tuesday, while he was on a job site in Murfreesboro laying the foundation for a commercial property that would later win a regional design award. He would not be in the mood to celebrate. The forgery was clean. She had used a notary named Brian Whitfield, who was later disbarred, and a quitclaim deed that transferred sole ownership of 4214 Elmcrest Drive to one Sandra K. Reeves, free and clear. As if Calvin's 12 years of labor on that property, the framing, the electrical, the floors he had refinished 3 times until the grain ran exactly the way he wanted, had never occurred. What Sandra did not know, what she had not thought to research because she had assumed a man who drove a 5-year-old pickup and packed his own lunch could not possibly have more than one asset worth considering, was that Calvin had purchased a second property 8 years earlier in a neighborhood she had never visited, through an LLC she had never heard of, under a name that appeared on no joint tax return she had ever signed. She did not know about the building on Buchanan Street. She did not know what it was worth. She did not know what Calvin had been doing with it, or what he had planned to do with it the moment she made her move. She had no idea that in real estate, as in construction, the most important structure is always the one you never see. What happened next would take everything Sandra thought she had stolen and return it to the man whose name she had erased. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning Calvin Reeves discovered what had been done to him was not dramatic. It was a Thursday in late October, cool and clear, the kind of morning Nashville produced a handful of times each autumn, where the light came in at an angle that made everything look more permanent than it was. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee, going through a stack of mail he had let accumulate for 4 days. Bills, a contractor catalog, a property tax notice from Davidson County. He almost set the tax notice aside without opening it. He opened it because his grandmother Dorothy had once told him that the only mail a man should never ignore was from the government or the Lord, and since the Lord did not tend to send envelopes, he opened it. The notice listed the owner of 4214 Elmcrest Drive as Sandra K. Reeves. His name did not appear. He read it twice. He set it down. He picked it up and read it again. His coffee grew cold beside him. Calvin Reeves had grown up in North Nashville, in a house his grandfather had purchased in 1961, a small craftsman on a street that had since changed its name twice and its demographics entirely. His grandfather Claude had been a plasterer, which in that era meant a man who spent his days rebuilding the insides of other people's homes while living modestly in his own. Claude had taught Calvin how to read a wall, how to press a palm flat against plaster, and know by temperature and resonance whether the structure beneath was sound or failing. Calvin had been 9 years old the first time he did this correctly. Claude had nodded in a way that meant more than words would have. Calvin had never forgotten the feeling of knowing something true about a thing from the outside that the thing itself could not tell you. Calvin's mother, Etta, had raised him after his father left when Calvin was 4, which was not a complicated story. Some men were not built for the work of staying, and Etta had recognized this early and reorganized accordingly, without bitterness, with the practicality of a woman who had learned from her own mother that the house you build inside yourself is the one no one can take from you. She had worked 22 years in hospital administration. She still lived in the house on Buchanan Street, not the Buchanan Street property, but her own house 3 blocks east, where she grew tomatoes in the back garden and watched her stories in the afternoon and asked Calvin every time he visited whether he was eating enough. He was 41 years old, and she still asked. He had met Sandra at an industry mixer in 2011, which he had attended reluctantly because his business partner Raymond had insisted. and Raymond was rarely wrong about the things that mattered. Sandra had been in real estate then, residential sales, the kind that involved open houses on Sundays, and a particular performance of enthusiasm that Calvin had initially mistaken for genuine warmth. She was sharp and well-dressed, and laughed at the right moments, and it seemed, in the first year of their courtship, to be genuinely interested in what Calvin did and why he did it. She had walked job sites with him in the early years. She had asked questions that suggested she understood load-bearing structures were not suggestions. He had believed she understood him. He had believed this for a long time after the evidence began suggesting otherwise. The first sign had been subtle enough to dismiss. A conversation with a mortgage broker, a man named Perry, who Sandra had introduced as a colleague, that had happened at a dinner party Calvin had not been invited to. Details of which had filtered back to him through a mutual friend in a way that suggested the dinner itself had been designed around his absence. Perry had later become Sandra's listing agent for a residential sale that had used a property description Calvin did not recognize, because the property described bore no resemblance to anything Sandra had told him she was working on. He had filed this away. He did not yet know what he was filing it toward. The second sign arrived 6 months later in the form of a document he had found not through searching, but through accident. A manila envelope on the passenger seat of Sandra's car that he had reached for reflexively. When she asked him to grab her sunglasses from the center console, and the envelope had shifted, and one page had slid into view before he had time to look away. It was a financial disclosure form. His name was not on it. The property at 4214 Elmcrest was listed with Sandra's name alone as sole owner, dated 11 months prior. He had tucked the page back into the envelope and handed Sandra her sunglasses and said nothing. He moved with the same deliberate calm that had defined all his actions in the months that followed. His face remained perfectly still. He had built the house on Elmcrest himself, over 4 years, on a lot he had purchased for $38,000 in 2009, when the market was soft and the neighborhood was transitioning, and Calvin had understood, the way men who read walls understand things, that the transition would eventually go one direction only. He had framed it himself on weekends, pulled permits under his own contractor's license, done the rough electrical and the finished carpentry, and the custom millwork on the built-ins that a designer friend had once photographed for a magazine. The house was worth $430,000 as of the most recent county assessment. Sandra had paid nothing toward its construction, and $600 a month toward the mortgage since they married, the amount they had agreed on, the amount that represented her fair share of a project that was already 90% complete when she moved in. He did not say any of this aloud to anyone for 3 weeks. He drove to his job sites. He ate dinner. He reviewed the tax notice 3 more times and then placed it in a folder on the desk in his home office and called his attorney. Franklin Webb had been Calvin's attorney for 9 years, since the time Calvin had incorporated his construction business and needed someone methodical and unimpressed by drama. Franklin was 58, deliberate, with a way of sitting in his chair that suggested he had heard everything and been alarmed by none of it. He listened to Calvin describe the tax notice, the financial disclosure form, the timeline of signs he had cataloged over the preceding 8 months. Then he asked 3 specific questions about the notary, the date of the filing, and whether Calvin still had the original purchase documents for the Elmcrest property. Calvin had all of it. He had everything. Franklin nodded once. "Give me 48 hours, he said. "Don't speak to her about the property. Don't change your routine. Don't give her a reason to move faster than she already has." Calvin drove home and cooked dinner. He set 2 plates on the table he had built from white oak. He listened to Sandra describe a showing she had done in Green Hills, and he asked one question, and she answered it, and they ate, and he washed the dishes, and she went to watch television, and he went to his office and opened the folder and added 2 more pages to it, and then sat for a long time in the quiet and thought about his grandfather Claude pressing a palm against a wall to know what was happening inside it. You didn't need to tear the wall open to know the structure was failing. You just needed to know how to listen. Preparation was the work. The rest was simply waiting for the structure to reveal itself. Franklin came back in 36 hours, not 48. He had obtained a copy of the fraudulent deed from the Davidson County Register of Deeds office and had forwarded it to a document examiner named Patricia Good, who had reviewed the notary's stamp and the signature block and produced a 1-page opinion stating that the acknowledgement was procedurally defective in 3 specific ways that made it invalid under Tennessee law, and that the notary's stamp had been applied to a document the notary had not personally witnessed being signed, which was a criminal matter separate from the civil fraud. "The deed is void," Franklin said. "Not voidable. Void, legally it never happened." He set the opinion on his desk. "But we want more than void. We want consequence." He had already been in contact with the Tennessee Real Estate Commission regarding Sandra's license. He had already spoken with a colleague in criminal law about the notary. He leaned back in his chair. "Now tell me about the Buchanan Street building." Calvin told him. The building on Buchanan Street had been purchased through a single-member LLC Calvin had formed in 2015, after a conversation with his accountant Marcus and a financial advisor named Leonard Cole, who had been recommended by Calvin's uncle Irvin, who had known Leonard since they served together at Fort Campbell in the 1980s. Leonard was 63 years old, methodical, and had a habit of asking questions that revealed he already knew the answer, but wanted you to say it yourself so you would remember it. He had asked Calvin in 2015 whether Calvin wanted his business assets and his personal assets to be visible from the same vantage point. Calvin had said no. Leonard had said, "Then, let's build a second room." The LLC had purchased a 4-unit commercial building on Buchanan Street for $212,000 in 2015. It had been renovated over the following 3 years, Calvin doing the structural work himself on weekends and evenings, using crews he trusted and compensated fairly. The building now housed a barber shop, a bookkeeper, a small insurance office, and a Caribbean restaurant on the ground floor, with 2 office suites on the second floor leased to a therapist and a notary public. A different notary public than Brian Whitfield, a legitimate one, who had been Calvin's tenant for 4 years and who paid on time every month. The building had been assessed in the most recent county cycle at $890,000. Sandra had never been told about the LLC. She had never been told about Buchanan Street. She had assumed, as people tend to assume about quiet men, that what was visible was all there was. Leonard Cole had compiled the financial picture into a clean 12-page summary covering the LLC's acquisition history, renovation costs, current lease agreements, and assessed value. He had done this not because Franklin had asked, but because Leonard was the kind of man who anticipated what would be needed before it was needed, which was what 30 years of advising people through complicated circumstances produced in a person. He set the summary on Calvin's desk on a Wednesday afternoon and said, "She went after a house. You have a building." He picked up his pen and made one small notation on the cover page. People who don't do careful research make that kind of error. They look at what's in front of them and stop looking. He capped the pen. That is their problem and your advantage. He stood and shook Calvin's hand and left. Because Leonard was also the kind of man who understood that some conversations were complete in under 10 minutes. Irvin, Calvin's uncle, his mother Etta's younger brother, was 70 years old and still lived in the house on Whispering Hills, where Calvin had spent every other Sunday of his childhood eating biscuits and learning how to hold a conversation with men who didn't waste words. He sat across from Calvin now at that same kitchen table with his coffee and listened to the full account. When Calvin finished, Irvin was quiet for a moment. He looked at the window above the sink. "Your grandfather used to say a man who shows you everything he has is a man who hasn't planned for winter." He turned back to Calvin. "She saw a pickup truck and a working-class address, and she wrote you down as a liability she could resolve." He picked up his coffee. She never once asked herself what the truck was paid for with, or what a man who builds buildings for a living does with the money they generate. He set the mug down. "That's the thing about people who move fast. They don't do the math." He folded his hands on the table. "Let Franklin do the legal work. Let Leonard do the financial work. You just keep building." Calvin had one more meeting before the reckoning. He drove to Etta's house on a Saturday morning and sat with her in the kitchen while she made biscuits she claimed she was making for herself, but always made too many of. He told her everything. She listened with the stillness of a woman who had been listening carefully her entire life and had learned that the most important responses were never the first ones. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, pressing the biscuit cutter into the dough with the same even pressure she had used for 50 years. "She thought you were what she could see," Etta said finally. She lifted a round of dough and placed it on the sheet. "Women like that spend their whole lives mistaking the surface for the structure." She looked at him. "You are your grandfather's grandson, Calvin, and your grandfather never once confused the two." She put the sheet in the oven and wiped her hands on her apron. "Now eat something. You've got work to do." Franklin Webb filed the petition to invalidate the fraudulent deed on a Monday morning and served Sandra at her office on Music Row at 1014 a.m. He filed simultaneously with the Tennessee Real Estate Commission a formal complaint against Sandra K. Reeves's broker license, attaching the document examiner's opinion, the county deed records, and a sworn statement from a title company that had attempted to run a title search on Elmcrest 3 months prior at Sandra's request and had discovered the anomaly and flagged it internally, but had not yet contacted the county. He filed a separate criminal referral to the district attorney's office regarding Brian Whitfield, the notary, which named Sandra as a co-conspirator in the fraudulent acknowledgement. The referral included Leonard Cole's financial analysis of Sandra's accounts over the preceding 2 years, which had been provided voluntarily, and which revealed, among other things, that Sandra had been in contact with Perry Hollins, the mortgage broker from the dinner Calvin hadn't been invited to, regarding a refinancing of the Elmcrest property that would have extracted $240,000 in equity and deposited it into an account in Sandra's name alone. The meeting with Sandra's attorney took place 12 days later in a 4th-floor conference room at a law office on Commerce Street. Sandra arrived composed, with the practiced expression of a woman who had sold real estate for 15 years and understood that the beginning of a negotiation was not the time to show what you actually felt. That expression lasted until Franklin set the first document on the table, which was the deed examiner's opinion. It lasted until he set down the second document, which was the criminal referral with her name on page 3. It lasted, precisely, until he set down the third document, which was a certified appraisal of the building on Buchanan Street accompanied by a 2-page summary of the LLC's revenue over the preceding 6 years. $412,000 in gross rents, net of expenses and taxes, accumulated in an account that bore no relationship to anything Sandra had believed she understood about Calvin's financial position. She looked at the appraisal. She looked at the revenue summary. She looked at Calvin. He had been watching her the way he watched structures, calmly, with the patience of a man who already knew what the inspection would reveal. Her attorney leaned close and spoke quietly into her ear. Sandra shook her head. She pressed her hands flat against the table. "I thought," she began. "Mrs. Reeves," Franklin's voice was even and unhurried, "what you thought is not relevant to what you did." He turned a page in the folder in front of him. "What is relevant is the certified deed, the documented fraud, the broker license complaint that is currently active, and the fact that the district attorney's office has had the criminal referral for 11 days. He looked at her without expression. "Your attorney will advise you on what those things collectively mean for your options." Calvin had not spoken yet. He had not needed to. He gathered the papers closest to him and aligned them at their edges, a habit so ingrained it was invisible to him, and then he looked at Sandra directly for the first time since they had sat down. "You deleted my name," he said quietly, "from a house I built with my hands. You erased 12 years of work in a county filing office on a Tuesday." He was not angry. He had processed the anger 4 months ago in the quiet of his office and had set it down the way you set down a tool that is no longer required. "What I want you to understand is that I never hid anything from you out of deception. I simply never believed you'd earned the full picture." He stood. "Now, you have it." He nodded to Franklin, picked up his jacket, and walked out. The hallway was quiet and clean, and the elevator opened immediately when he pressed the button, which he took as the universe being efficient about things, the way it sometimes was when the work had been done correctly. 11 months later, Calvin Reeves was standing in the back office of the Buchanan Street building on a Friday afternoon, reviewing the lease renewal for the barber shop on the ground floor. The building's occupancy was full. The exterior had been repainted in the spring, a deep warm gray that Calvin had chosen himself after considering it for 3 weeks. Because color on a building was a permanent decision, and permanent decisions deserved consideration. He had added a mural on the east-facing wall, commissioned from a local artist, depicting the neighborhood as it had looked in 1955 and as it looked now, side by side, which had generated more goodwill from tenants and neighbors than he had anticipated, and which his mother Etta had cried at briefly before declaring that he got that from his grandfather. His company had completed 3 significant projects in the preceding year, including a mixed-use development in East Nashville that had required everything he knew about load paths and neighborhood history and the particular stubbornness of old concrete. He had hired 2 new crew members. He had promoted Raymond's nephew to site supervisor. The business was sound. He had built it to be sound. That was the only way he knew how to build anything. He had also, quietly and without announcement, begun work on a mentorship program through the local Contractors Association, pairing young men from North Nashville with licensed tradespeople, paying the stipends himself through the LLC, telling no one except Etta and Irvin and Leonard, who had all responded in the particular way of people who are not surprised by a thing, but are nonetheless moved by it. Yolanda Marsh had come into his life through his accountant, who had introduced them at a small dinner in the spring, not with any obvious intention, but with the kind of casual arrangement that sometimes turned out to be deliberate in retrospect. She ran a nonprofit focused on affordable housing development in underserved neighborhoods, and she had opinions about zoning law and construction costs that she delivered without apology, which Calvin found more refreshing than he had expected. She was precise. She was unhurried. She had asked him, on their second conversation, what he was most proud of having built, and he had thought about it for a full 30 seconds before answering, which she had seemed to respect. She was not a woman who filled silences with noise. She had come to see the Buchanan Street building on a Saturday 2 months ago and had walked through each floor without performing enthusiasm. asking specific questions about the renovation choices and what the neighborhood had been before, and what Calvin thought it was becoming. He had answered honestly. She had listened the way his grandmother had listened, fully, without preparing her response while he was still speaking. He had found this remarkable enough to remember. What he had heard of Sandra came third-hand and without seeking. Her broker's license had been suspended pending the outcome of the commission review. She had settled the civil case, returning the equity she had attempted to extract and paying the legal fees associated with the fraudulent filing. Brian Whitfield, the notary, had entered a plea agreement in the criminal matter, and his disbarment had followed shortly after. Sandra had relocated to a smaller apartment in Antioch. Perry Hollins had quietly left the Nashville market. The dinner parties on the circuit they had run together had redistributed themselves, as social networks tend to do when one person in them becomes a liability, around other centers entirely. Calvin set the lease renewal in his outbox. Through the window of the back office, he could see the mural on the east wall, the old neighborhood and the new one side by side, each true in its own moment. He thought about his grandfather Claude pressing a palm flat against a wall to hear what was happening inside it. He thought about Etta's kitchen and biscuits made in quantities that presupposed a visitor. He thought about the moment he had read that tax notice at the kitchen table on a cool October morning and understood precisely what had been done and what would need to be done in response. He had not panicked. He had not raged. He had opened a folder and begun documenting, the way a builder documents, the way a man who understands that a structure is only as good as its record-keeping documents, methodically, completely, without sentiment. Some things were worth the patience to build correctly. He turned off the office light. He locked the door. He walked out into the Nashville afternoon and got into his truck and drove towards something that was still becoming. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.